Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review. This show is being recorded on Tuesday, January 25th, 2022. I'm Asbet Bedrosyan, and along with Hovik Manucharian, this week we're going to talk about the following major topics. President Armen Sarkissian resigns, Russia-NATO standoff over Ukraine, and Vahan Kerobyan, Minister of Comedy.
We have Dr. Pietro Shakarian, a lecturer in history at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. His research focuses on the history of Soviet Armenia and the Caucasus. He's very well adept on the issues of Russia and Ukraine, so we're happy to have him talk about these issues with us. Welcome, Pietro.
Hovik, Asbet, thank you both for having me on your show again.
Same here, Pietro.
It's been an event-filled weekend. President Armen Sarkissian announced his resignation on Sunday, January 23rd. Prior to that, the president was on a visit to countries in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, working on establishing opportunities in energy, as well as investment and financing for such projects in Armenia. And from the UAE, the president's office announced that he was taking a short vacation to undergo a medical examination. And then it all started. In his resignation letter, he complained that the constitution doesn't give him enough influence, so he's resigning. Then, on Monday, January 24th, Het published a scandalous story alleging that Armen Sarkissian was a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis, a small Caribbean island country known for its offshore banking reputation. According to Het, Sarkissian wrote back to the investigation team shortly before his resignation, claiming that he tried to, relinquish his citizenship in that country, but the person handling his paperwork had passed away unbeknownst to him. I guess that's better than the dog ate his paperwork. But anyway, this report from Het is damning if true. But we also heard conflicting reasons presented in the media. So we're gonna, I just want to cover them four major theories, which I'm actually running a poll on Twitter about these. So number one, the theory that he explains is that suddenly, 4 years after the fact, he realized that his position is too weak, he lacks influence, so he's quitting. Number two is, the Het story, meaning that he is a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis, whose motto, by the way, is country above self. You looked it up on Wikipedia, and so that's a nice motto to have for a country. Third reason in some social media circles is that they see his resignation as a prelude to constitutional reform in Armenia. We know that Pashinyan had expressed an opinion that he wants the constitution to be reverted to a semi-presidential one, and maybe, just maybe, this is sort of part of that plan, and they'll have some caretaker president before, until the constitution is finalized. Maybe he just didn't want to be the sitting duck caretaker. I don't know.
Lame duck, yeah.
Yeah, lame duck, yeah. And number four, given the timing, a lot of people see major, bad news for Armenia on the Armenian-Turkish and Armenian-Azerbaijani front, some major agreements to be signed, and he doesn't want to have his legacy tainted by that. I don't know. So, Pietro, I gave you the four things that I thought of. Can you help make sense? And maybe, did I miss any theory that you are especially fond of?
Let's go through each of these points one by one. I think that there is some truth in the first two of these, points. I think that when we get to point number three about the prelude to constitutional reform, then the question becomes, why would the current system, how is it not benefiting Pashinyan? Because Pashinyan as prime minister already has significant power as it is. So why would he? The president already has no power. President Armen Sarkissian effectively, was in office a lame duck anyway. So what would the motive be for Pashinyan? And also, why would Armen Sarkissian is known to have a kind of a conflicting relationship with Pashinyan. So why would he suddenly step aside and do Pashinyan a favor? That doesn't make any sense. So then also the other theory about, is there trouble on the Armenian-Turkish horizon, Armenia-Azerbaijani horizon? There may very well be. But if Armen Sarkissian was still president as that was happening, the reality is that his office specifically wouldn't be tainted with that because he's not making that decision. The person who would be, it's like, so you can't get any worse. I mean, well, I guess you could get worse, but the November 10th statement, that was pretty bad, but we don't associate that with Armen Sarkissian. In fact, the Armenian public, most of the Armenian public, made a clear distinction between Armen Sarkissian as a potential alternative to Pashinyan in the aftermath of that agreement. So I don't think it is the fourth one. It is possible it is the second one. That is, quite possible. I don't know all the ins and outs of it. I mean, again, it would require further investigation. In terms of the first one, it is possible that there might have been some tipping point politically that made him finally give up the post. That made him finally, because I think that maybe he was thinking these past 4 years, maybe I could milk the presidential position in some way. Maybe there would be some way that I could make it more influential than it is. Maybe the man can make the post. I think that was what he was kind of calculating. Well, but I think in the end, he came probably into some sort of conflict with the prime minister or the administration, the ruling elite in Armenia, and I think that probably was the tipping point that forced him to take this, action. There's also the matter of health. We can't discard that. If there is a health concern here, then that also may be playing a role in this as well too.
I was following some of the opposition influencers, such as Armen Ashotyan, who criticized Sarkissian for choosing to flee at this particular moment when there are storm clouds, gathering over Armenia's head. So essentially, I guess point number 4, he additionally claimed that this will pave a way for Pashinyan to completely consolidate power. I guess point number 3. But asked that question myself. And if it was a constitutional system, why does Pashinyan want to do that? Especially given with the current parliamentary system, he has, he can get re-elected as prime minister forever. Whereas with presidential, he might have some term limits. Also, you mentioned that he's known to be antagonistic to Pashinyan, or they have some kind of a friction. Well, at least Arthur Vanetsyan from I Have Honor does not think that. He said that the resignation came much too late, and that Sarkissian has actively cooperated with Pashinyan, mainly fulfilling all of the whims of the latter. And I have to agree with him because, at least from my memory, whenever there was a critical juncture where, he could have intervened, he could have sent a particular decision to the Constitutional Court, for instance. One of the latter more important events was when Pashinyan dismissed Onik Gasparian and Armen Sarkissian refused to send the matter to the Constitutional Court to see whether that decision was constitutional, and as a result, effectively, he
allowed him to be fired.
He allowed him to be fired. So there are many cases like this where when they were actually trying to make major changes to the constitution at the Armenian parliament before it was before the June 20th elections last year, and all that was needed was for him to refer that decision, that law that they passed to the Constitutional Court. He didn't do that.
Hovik, I felt like actually it was a very frustrating time that we went through after the war, when there were all these firings that would go to the president, he wouldn't sign, and I felt like all of his powers were basically time limited, right? He had a number of days before which he would send it. He would either approve or would send it to the Constitutional Court, and he would do that, and then the Constitutional Court would generally have a couple of days to do this or that. It just felt to me like those powers were very limited. Frankly, if there was a resignation to be tendered, maybe that was a better time to do it and say, this office is ineffective. I don't know why it would come to a year and a half later now, which gives us the opportunity to ponder over all the reasons you already mentioned, and I think you've already covered those. I wanted to say that I thought all of the opinions we've heard from analysts and politicians, like you mentioned Ashodian, Vanetsyan, and even ruling party people who have sounded off on this, have been all very passive, and I've gotten the feeling that all sides agree that it really doesn't matter that the president has resigned or not resigned, because the president doesn't do a whole lot anyway.
Yeah, well, I think it's also symbolic. I think that is a
Yeah.
symbol of kind of the frustration that people are feeling, that actually the president himself has felt with the position, that he's very limited, his hands are tied. Also, keep in mind, I mean, this was the president who called for Pashinyan to resign, right? So this is also something else, another piece of evidence we have to take into account.
But then he did a U-turn, backing the elections. As I was saying to a friend who, like, sort of, I was arguing with online, I don't want to sound nihilist, but it's better that if he's not going to sort of be the check and balance person to Pashinyan on critical issues, then maybe it's better for him not be there, and we'll have Alain Simonian as president, and we'll know that there's no hope, or we'll know things are how they are. I'd much rather have someone like that than to think that maybe this time he'll find some courage.
But I think it most likely had to be some sort of kind of tipping point. There was some sort of internal issue that caused this, that we are not privy to, that probably in the coming years, even maybe in the coming months, we'll find out more about it.
By the way, this issue of his dual citizenship came up right when he was actually being nominated. He was nominated by Serge Sarkissian in 2018. During his nomination proceedings, the opposition, Nikol Pashinyan at the time, asked him, like, are you really a citizen of Armenia only? And they asked him to provide proof of that. And he basically gave this very sidestepping answer where he said, basically, I believe.
Sarkissian-esque.
Yeah, I think he said that, yes, I did apply to citizenship for multiple countries, to the UK, I think, specifically, but I always felt as an Armenian citizen at heart. and he also said that I'm now a citizen of only Armenia, officially. And when they asked him, well, when you tender, when you relinquish your citizenship in the UK, you're supposed to get a confirmation letter from the Home Office that you're essentially you're no longer a citizen. And they asked him to furnish that as evidence, and he said, well, I've submitted all the paperwork requested of me. But what's interesting is that when Pashinyan came to power, that was one of the major issues, and like I think within the first few months, he basically made an announcement saying, I talked with Armen Sarkissian about this, and he showed me some additional paperwork, and I'm happy that he's, I'm convinced that he's a citizen.
Yeah, and actually, there was even talk from some quarters of Pashinyan's supporters that Pashinyan should get rid of Armen Sarkissian, that he should get rid of everything completely associated with the previous regime or the ancien regime. So I think that that too, it's really quite interesting. If we look at that citizenship issue, because it came up earlier, that would be another reason why I would be skeptical. That why now? Why now? Is it why now would it have provoked him?
And that's the key question,
resign?
I think.
This is the biggest question we have to look. Why now? Why now? So we can bring up a whole bunch of different things, but it would not be. None of these theories answer that question. Why now?
On my Twitter poll, I was surprised because only 3% of the responders had actually selected the head article being the reason why he resigned. I also don't agree that was like sort of so scandalous that he had to resign. But the timing issue is very important.
The timing issue is incredibly important. I would say that I think that
it's
probably
the key question.
It is motivated by either some sort of crisis in his political relationship with the prime minister and his administration, or it is due to health, or it is a combination of both. But I don't think it has anything to do with this, his offshore accounts, or the prelude that he's doing a favor to Pashinyan by stepping down, or anything like this. I think that there is some sort of tipping point that caused him to do this, and that the frustration is coming out, that he doesn't have enough power to change things, that he doesn't have enough power to influence the situation. Because people were even saying, actually, after the November statement, that maybe Armen Sarkissian would be an alternative to Pashinyan. There was even that talking point as well, too. So Armen Sarkissian always kind of had bigger ambitions. Maybe it's a prelude to a bid for the prime ministership. That's also another possibility.
Well, I thought
But
actually he might consider running back in June, but that didn't happen.
But if there's a health issue involved, that might exclude that. But if he is laying the groundwork for a prime minister run, or a run for the prime ministership, that might be a game changer in terms of where Armenian domestic politics has been going. Because right now, since the end of the war, it's been going in circles, as we all know.
If he's really a citizen of another country and it's out in the open now, I think that that sort of precludes him from running. I mean, it's one thing to be caught like being a dual citizen, and they can probably come up with different ways to.
At least the ruling party can find some kind of a technical reason
to brush it under the carpet. But yeah, now if he wants to run anew, and if the head article is truly correct, where he admitted to them that he is a dual citizen, he forgot to cancel the citizenship. It's like a subscription to Time magazine or something. Personally, I don't think that's feasible. But so, what are the next steps in the process? I did a little bit of research, and I just want to mention what I found. So, according to Article 147 of the Rules of Procedure for the National Assembly, the former president, so the decision takes effect from when he actually files his resignation. So he is a former president now, but he has 1 week to actually rescind his resignation. Anytime in the 7 days after his resignation, he can say, "Oops, I changed my mind," and he will be president again.
So that week extends from January 23rd to January 30th.
Yeah, and all constitutional legal timers start on January 30th. Mm-hmm. Then there will be a new parliamentary vote. That one is slated to take place no earlier than 25 and no later than 35 days after January 30th. So when the counting starts. Until that time, Alen Simonyan is the acting president of Armenia. Also, from January 30th, there will be a 5-day window during which new nominees for president can be put forth by any group of deputies comprising 1/4 of the total count of deputies of the National Assembly. This means that the opposition too can nominate a candidate. So now the elections are going to be the interesting part. They can take up to 3 rounds. So during the first round, in order to elect a president, the National Assembly must vote by a margin of 3/4 of total votes. So, civil contract doesn't have that many votes.
I think they need to have 81 votes.
Yeah. So if the opposition wants to put up a fight, then they can drag this to round 2 at least. So the second round must select a winner by 3/5 of the total votes. Anyway, so this one, I read that they do have enough votes with the current sort of membership in the faction. And lastly, even if that fails, then the elections go to a 3rd round, and the majority then selects president. So, I think I think the opposition may put up a fight just.
Yeah, depending who the candidate is.
Actually, it's not really a question. I guess it is. Who do you guys think are the contenders for the president?
Some of the names that have been tossed around that I'm aware of: Edmond Marokyan, Aram Zaveni Sarkissian, even Artak Zeynalyan, who was a former Minister of Justice. I've also heard Ruben Vartanyan's name.
Well, Ruben Vartanyan, I would say a couple of things about some of these people. So first of all, Edmond Marokyan, if I were Edmond Marokyan, I would not, take this position. I think that, first of all, it doesn't give him any satisfaction. It doesn't give him any political power. It doesn't give him any influence to do what he wants to do. Right? This is a man with an agenda. He wouldn't be able to implement it. Now, Aram Zaveni Sarkissian, he is known to be very anti-Russian. And what kind of a face would that be of Armenia to have that as your president in this critical time, when the relations with Russia are, of the utmost paramount importance? I mean, just think about that.
Yeah,
so,
makes sense.
And as for Ruben Vartanyan, I think Ruben Vartanyan has bigger ambitions than this position. I think that anybody who's been watching Armenian politics has noticed the frustration that Armen Sarkissian has had with such a limited position as the kind of figurehead president of the state. I think that I'm not sure if anybody would really want this position, because there's only so much you can do. You're hamstrung. And the challenges facing Armenia today are such that if you really want to make a change, I mean, the presidency is not your avenue for making that change.
Right.
Hovig, I think I've also seen an article that mentioned Armen Tatoyan.
He is, I don't know when his term expires as...
Next month, as a matter of fact. The new ombudsman got elected yesterday. I think she comes to power in a month or so.
I think the biggest takeaway point from all this is the timing of the resignation, because it could not be something that, would have been an issue like, let's say, 5 years ago. It was some sort of tipping point that made him do this.
Definitely.
In fact, he was in UAE when he tendered his resignation. I mean, at least based on all the facts out there, he didn't even come to Armenia. And from what I'm hearing, he has no plans on returning to Armenia.
So there must have been some urgency behind this announcement.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go to the next topic, Ukraine. Osped.
All right. Pietro, a couple of weeks ago on our podcast, you called on Biden to talk to Russia and find a resolution to the differences, which have since only become more aggravated between Russia and the West. These differences are primarily manifesting themselves as the Ukraine crisis right now, but of course they're much wider ranging. So the first round of US-Russia or US-NATO talks, quote-unquote, failed, shall we say it. Both sides gave standard press releases that they wish to avoid war, to continue talks, etc. But let's go beyond these buzzwords. Can you help us unpack what the Russia-West issue is right now? What are the specific demands by Russia? What are the specific demands by NATO and the US?
Well, you really have, two very different positions. So the first question is, what does Russia want? In terms of what Russia wants basic security. Again, I talked about on your podcast the promise to Gorbachev that was broken by the US, not to expand NATO 1 inch past the former East Germany, and NATO today is all the way on the doorstep of St. Petersburg, and potentially it could take in Ukraine and Georgia as well, which would really put NATO very, very close, even closer, deeply into toward Russia's borders. So Russia's demand is very simple. They just don't want, the NATO military alliance to go that far, to be on the territory of a country, Ukraine, that it has had intimate relations with for centuries. I mean, again, going back to Kievan Rus, even you could take it back that far. But it just does not want to have a kind of a security threat on its border. It does not want to have to deal with NATO on its, western frontiers or southern frontiers. It doesn't need any of that. So what it ideally wants is Ukraine that is non-aligned, a Ukraine that is friendly, has good relations with Russia, is not confrontational. So it does not want a war in Ukraine. It does not want a war, period. And it is also not in the interests of, continental Europe to have a war, of course, in Ukraine. Now, NATO still wants to expand. They argue that, the government of Ukraine wants to join NATO, and we should allow it to join NATO if it freely wishes to do so. But NATO is not the American Association of Retired People. It's not just, it's not a fraternity or sorority. You can't just join NATO. And it's a security alliance. So if the country joining NATO enhances NATO's security, then you want that country to join. But let me ask you this. Would Ukraine joining NATO, Osped, if Ukraine were to join NATO, if Georgia were to join NATO, would that enhance the security of Germany, France, Spain, any of these countries?
I don't think it would, and I don't think that the security of those countries would be enhanced, either Georgia or Ukraine, because in reality, the mounting tensions between them and Russia is essentially a definition of lower security situation.
Yeah, I mean, the only party it would benefit would be the American War Party and the American military-industrial complex, which would get money from such an arrangement. Ukraine would buy weapons that it doesn't need. It would be in this perpetual kind of conflict with Russia, and frankly, it doesn't benefit anybody. But you have
I
two very diverging positions, though, because
yeah.
Washington now, at least the current administration in Washington, supports this kind of pro-NATO stance of Ukraine, or the pro-NATO stance on Ukraine, I should say, because we've had news this past week that the Ukrainians themselves are not, too hep on this idea of a war.
Well, we were talking just before the show, Pietro, and you were saying that the defense minister of Ukraine has also said that he doesn't believe that the chances of Russia invading are significant.
But we also had a statement from Zelensky where he basically said that apparently emboldened by the show of Western support, he said, I'm convinced that the time has come to move to offensive actions to defend our national interests, fanning the flames there. So, it's a little bit conflicting.
Yeah. And it also shows you, so Ukraine, we know, is a country that is profoundly divided by history. I mean, it's profoundly divided by geography, language. You have, of course, the South and the East, which is all Russian speaking, very intimately and deeply integrated in Russian culture. So the city of Odessa, let's say, is very Russian, or Kharkiv is very Russian. But then you also have the West. You have Lviv, which is very, very kind of Western oriented. It was part of Poland. It was part of Austria. And then in the center there with Kiev, it's kind of mixed between the two, right? So it's a mixed country. And even within the political elite, you don't know, like defense minister says one thing, Zelensky says another thing.
So first of all, besides the Biden-Putin meeting, last week we had a very impromptu meeting between Lavrov and Blinken, I just want to mention, which apparently also did not resolve anything because the public spat continued and even escalated. But Biden's foot in the mouth moment. I mean, to be honest, Biden's foot has made a frequent appearance in his mouth. But this is the most baffling, that I've seen. Earlier in the week, January 20th to be precise, Biden held a press conference. He threatened severe and coordinated response to a Russian attack. But at the same time, he made a distinction between a minor incursion and a full-blown attack, essentially saying something like, if they, do a minor incursion, then, it won't be as harsh. So let me ask, I guess, what does that mean? Most of you, I guess, anything besides Kiev is okay, is up for grabs. What gives, Pietro? I mean, what's going on?
No. I think that Biden does not know what he's talking about when he's talking about Ukraine, although, his son was very much involved in very scandalous affairs in Ukraine. There was a New York Times expose on him a few years ago, which has been hushed up.
Hunter Biden's laptop.
Hunter Biden's laptop. I mean, well, even before this, the laptop scandal itself, there was a New York Times expose a few years ago that openly discussed these issues. But when it came around election time, discussion of them disappeared. But it's interesting because Biden really doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, it's very clear with this situation. And it seems like many in his administration are driving him toward a more bellicose position. Now, it's interesting because there are some it's interesting to see the perceptions of what's going on from the two sides. So what do I mean? So Putin put forth, this proposal on, this is basically what we want. Let's talk about it. Let's negotiate, right? And it's very clear that the Russians, of course, they don't want NATO on their borders. From the Russian point of view, it's seen as, look, this is finally us putting our foot down, and we're actually putting forth a very reasonable proposal, right? Actually, when I talk to people here in Yerevan, they actually agree with that. This is, the Russian point of view is a reasonable point of view. Now, I've heard from the American side that, there are American analysts saying, well, Putin, he's giving an ultimatum, he's putting down demands that, how can he do this, and da. Even people who support who support peace with Russia, who don't want confrontation in Ukraine, perceive it as a demand. So it's interesting to see kind of the different perceptions of, what one side does versus how the other side reacts to that action on this issue. But I think that, the fact that the defense minister of Ukraine came out to kind of shoot down this war talk is very important and very significant. But I also would argue that there is a role to be played here by continental Europe, because continental Europe is on the front line of this conflict. I mean, it's right there. So if you were to deploy kind of short-range nuclear missiles, God forbid, let's hope that doesn't happen. But it would Germany would be certainly affected by that. France would be affected by that. All of the Western European countries and Eastern European countries, Central and Eastern European countries, would be affected by this.
Pietro, I have a quick question. Is there, so with the statement of the Minister of Defense in Ukraine, do you see that there's daylight between their president and the Minister of Defense?
For sure, there is daylight between the president and the Minister of Defense, and I think that there is. I think that the war can be averted.
I want to disagree actually with that. I think the defense minister's statement is mostly geared towards internal consumption. All those young Ukrainian men who are worried that they may be drafted soon, I think that's sort of, he's trying to temper. I don't think no one wants a war, but if any war happens, it's going to be very bloody.
And the tragedy of this whole week too is that there was a war. That these are people who are, all Slavs, right? And they're fighting each other. They're killing each other. In most cases, they're speaking the same language. And that's the tragedy that was the tragedy of the Donbass war. Now, in terms of this being for internal consumption, it is quite likely. But also you have to think it got out there. It's even reported in TASS, the major Russian state news agency. That's like the top story. Right now, now the top story is actually Lukashenko in Belarus now talking about beefing up border security with Ukraine.
Ukraine is doing everything to consolidate this anti-Russian position. I was even sort of, reading that the United States is actually launching sanctions against several ethnic Russians in Ukraine, members of Ukrainian parliament, because they are pro-Russian. So I don't think that, my own personal opinion is that there are strings being pulled, and Ukraine is not sort of acting autonomously here. But
is Zelensky's government secure? I haven't really followed.
No, Zelensky. There are some serious internal issues here because Zelensky, you have to think, came in to Ukraine as the peace candidate, right? He came in as the person who was saying, "Let's talk to Russia." Actually, that's actually the irony of all this. But he's facing a severe domestic problem because in Ukraine, even though they're not popular, as a result of the Maidan, the far right, the fascists, have incredible influence in Kiev now, political influence. And Zelensky is afraid that if he's losing popularity, his popularity was in decline. He's afraid that if he acts too compromising toward Russia, they're going to launch a coup d'etat, and then there's going to be like a far right government in Ukraine. So he is under incredible domestic political pressure to do something and to really kind of also improve his poll ratings, because his poll ratings were sinking there, like a rock. So I think that this is also connected with that too. And I also think that the American War Party and NATO is taking full advantage of it because they want, of course, that they believe in this doctrine of containing Russia. So if you go back again to our favorite op-ed, actually not really
right,
op-ed.
But in doing so, I think they've really painted the guy into a corner.
Well, I think that they have, and actually, he's kind of a tragic figure in this way. This was a man whose career was mainly as a comedian.
I was going to say that's right.
So, Pietro, like you mentioned, the American War Party. Like, to be honest, like I always had that doubts about that term, that the Democratic Party is the war party. It has become recently, obviously, but I always internally had doubts about that. So why do the Democrats want to do this?
Well, I think I can tell you why. The Democrats traditionally would not want to do this. Right. So the Democrat Party, if you talk about the Democrats, like in the 70s, this was the party that was against the war in Vietnam. Right. This was the party that many Democrat voters were against the war in Iraq. Now, many Democratic politicians voted for the war, but many Democratic voters and American liberals, majority of American liberals, were against the war in Iraq. And so what do we have now? I think a lot of it is driven by this kind of Trump derangement syndrome that is connected with this belief that Putin personally hacked the American election and that they feel that we have to somehow get back at Putin for his dastardly deeds, right?
And Trump.
And I think that and Trump. So get back at Putin and Trump. Sometimes, both Trump and Putin, they see them as like the same thing or whatever. But the bottom line is, I think it is connected with that kind of, that kind of, Trump derangement syndrome, unfortunately. Now, there are many thinking liberals who don't like Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown, the former governor of California, is very much critical of any kind of war rhetoric against Russia and China, right? So this is another,
I really don't believe that this has anything to do with the Democratic Party or Republican Party.
No, I agree. Actually, I would say Osbed is correct on this. I would say that it is not the war party in America. It does not see party. That's right. Actually the bottom line.
When we're talking about the American War Party, we're talking about the deep state foreign policy establishment that has some neocon roots at this point, because they've been around for about 25, 30 years, and they're pushing for an American hegemony around the world, right? And this is their Cold War mentality that they have to surround. It used to be Soviet Union, and now it's Russia. So they just haven't moved. When we're talking about Putin. When we're talking about Putin making demands, presenting demands to Biden, basically he is wanting in writing what the conversations had been between Gorbachev and Reagan.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? And also,
essentially, he's saying, put that in writing, and we'll have something of a legal basis for our agreements.
I would also add to this too. This talk about. It's not only about confronting Russia; it's also about confronting China. And I do agree with you absolutely, Osbed. It sees this war party sees no one party. Now, I think they're taking advantage of liberal outrage against Putin and Trump. But I think you're correct, because even under Trump, who was supposedly the pro-Putin candidate, you had John Bolton in there.
Yeah.
So who was the most anti-Russian, pro-war with Iran kind of guy. And on top of it, I also want to talk about the confrontation with China. There is big rhetoric to also, confront China, not only to villainize, Putin in Russia, but also to villainize Xi too. And I think that this is absolute madness, because that's also a nuclear armed country. I mean,
I also want to mention some of the other things that are going around in terms of the rhetoric. U.S. actually ordered staff reductions in its Kiev embassy. The security warning for the travel warning is level 4 already, but it was updated to include this conflict. UK is actually the major former EU power and current European power that is defending the flames here. They accuse Russia of trying to install a puppet government in Ukraine. The evidence, of course. Yes, it's secret. It's top secret evidence. And as you mentioned, Pietro, Putin has said that,
available only here on Groong, by the way.
Yes. You have to go to our website, so groong.org. But also, Putin has repeatedly said that they're not planning on attacking Ukraine. But at the same time, he has not ruled out provocations from Ukraine. And he has, put down his foot firmly, saying that Russia will not tolerate Ukraine as a member of NATO.
Let me throw out something. I just want to throw out something. So think about this with Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine have deep intimate ties. It's in Russia's interest to have, a peaceful Ukraine on its borders there, right? Now, do you think, Hovig, and this is a question for Osbed too, do you think that Putin personally and Russia, do you think that the Russian Federation is interested in taking over Ukraine? I'm just throwing that out there.
I don't. Actually, I'm heartened to see at least some semblance of reason within some elements of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. I'm following John Evans actually, and his tweets are getting more dire. But he has offered to be a mediator between Russia and United States on this issue. And he's a voice of reason.
Hovig, we should get him on this podcast.
And also too, yes. Jack Matlock, the former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, and then also, Anatol Lieven, the Quincy Institute. That's a ray of light right there to kind of bring some rational discussion to this issue of Ukraine. But I think that at the end of the day, kind of going to what you said, Russia has no interest in taking over Ukraine. I mean, Putin has no interest in, covering these people's pensions. It's ridiculous to think that they want to take it over. What they want is a safe Ukraine. They don't want a NATO-allied Ukraine on their borders for the sake of national security. That's very plain.
Pedro, you mentioned Europe, and Europe is probably going to suffer the most out of this. But what's interesting is that major European powers seem to not be all on board on this. For instance, Germany is apparently stopping any shipments, NATO shipments, weapons to Ukraine. In fact, a German top naval officer, Schoenbach, was sacked. But before he was sacked, he said that Putin should be respected, and I believe he also mentioned something about that it was Ukraine who lost Crimea a decade ago. Sweden seems to be also joining the party,
and also don't forget Paris too. I mean, France is a very rational actor when it comes to these sorts of issues. Now, if you throw UK in the mix, I mean, of course that's kind of a wild card. I mean, the French, for example, would say, with the Brexit, many in Paris were probably saying good riddance to the UK, because they probably saw the UK as a Trojan horse in Europe, so to speak, because it was not advancing the interests of continental Europe. It was advancing the interests of the UK. So, yeah.
But at least from public posturing, it seems Germany is the flag bearer here. But, I want to ask, is this really posturing? And how likely is war? For instance, I've been reading some analyses that there are hundreds of thousands of soldiers that Russia has accumulated on the border with Ukraine, but so has Ukraine, and on the same border. But just normal theory of war states that, if you're the attacking side, you would need to have like a multiple of those forces, like, 5 or 10 times as much in order to be able to break through. So that has led some analysts to say, Russia does not really intend to attack, because if they did, they would have 500,000, for instance. But if that is really not the case, then why is all this public posturing from and is it simply like a high stakes game of poker between the West and Russia? And what has the West to gain out of this?
I don't think the West has anything to gain out of it. I don't think the United States has anything to gain out of it. I think that people in the American military industrial complex have something to gain out of it, selling weapons, because war is profitable. But I don't think it would benefit American national security. It wouldn't benefit European national security. It wouldn't benefit British national security. I think it's utter folly. I think that there is a very serious threat of sleepwalking into war. We know the book, The Sleepwalkers, about World War I. Okay, and I think that if this were to occur, it would be a catastrophe, because we're talking about nuclear weapons potentially being used, not just conventional arms. I mean, if we talk about what if scenario, I mean, we're talking about a very, very violent and bloody war. Ukraine, you have to also think too. I mean, we were witness recently to the war in Donbass. But Ukraine has a history of war. I mean, if we go back to the period of the Russian Civil War in 1918, 1923, Ukraine was the bloodiest front. And W. Bruce Lincoln, who wrote the book on the Russian Civil War, once wrote that no region of the Russian Empire witnessed more violence, more destruction, and more unvarnished cruelty of man to man during Russia's civil war than the Ukraine. So right there, Ukraine is not, and also, like I talked about the divisions, you have the East, which is East and the South, which is all Russian speaking. You have the West, which is very Western oriented, very Ukrainian speaking. We think of Lviv, where they don't like to speak Russian. And then you have the center, Kiev, and you have the mixed areas of central Ukraine. So this potentially would be a very, very violent and protracted war. And I don't even want to think about what would be involved with that. That's just thinking about it even as a conventional war, because if there are nuclear weapons involved and it becomes a wider European war, then God help us. I mean, it's just...
And Hovig, you were asking whether this is posturing or not. Let me just roll it back to something we were talking about, and that was the war party, or the foreign establishment, the foreign policy establishment in America. The person who was the outlier in all of that establishment was Trump, who tried to disengage, who didn't want to pay for the wars abroad and everything. This is basically, I think, the re-engagement of the United States and NATO into all these intrigues, right? I think
Hmm.
it does have posturing. They want to seem tough on Russia, and that's what's going on right now.
And also, it doesn't benefit the United States because look at how many domestic problems we have in America. I mean, you don't.
We've always had that. It's just there's a complete disengagement of our national treasury from our national priorities and needs in America.
But especially now, I would say, Osbeth, that there is a major disconnect between the foreign policy elite
Yeah.
and the domestic needs, because we really have major domestic crises that need to be resolved
Hmm.
and right away. I mean, it's always been the case that America might be involved in foreign adventures when it should be focused domestically, but especially now, especially in this situation, we really need to reshift focus, I think.
But as many have said, like even if there is no major nuclear conflict, the probability of an accidental conflagration that it takes a regional form is not insignificant. So, does it make sense for us as Armenians to think about what if scenarios? What if there is a localized but still a major confrontation between Russia and Ukraine? What happens of Armenia's membership in CSTO and potential obligations that Armenia may have? What happens to the Armenia-Georgia border, Armenia-Iran border? Will Turkey and Azerbaijan try to take advantage of the situation? I mean, it just seems like for us, we're in a spectator seat, but we're like, how does Armenia get out of this with as few losses as possible in long term?
And also, Russia has a major problem with Turkey, right to the south. I mean, and also, I mean, not only in the Caucasus, but even in Central Asia, as we witnessed. I mean, with Kazakhstan, So I mean, there is this. Turkey is also playing its role as a NATO member in the effort to contain Russia.
Absolutely.
But in terms of what would happen potentially, if you're talking about a Russia-Ukraine war, or God forbid, if there was any kind of civil conflict within Russia, it would be utterly catastrophic for Armenia.
My personal opinion is that if Turkey would probably not directly be involved, because that would mean involvement of NATO and Russia-NATO war, but I think that basically Aliyev would have a carte blanche, essentially, take Zangezur or whatever,
That's my biggest concern, actually, that with all this affair in Ukraine, Russia's attention will be so consumed with that scene that the South Caucasus will be a secondary priority for them, and they'll forget about it.
And I don't think they should. I don't think they should. They should look at all these issues at once. I mean, they should look at it. This is a big picture issue where, they're facing multiple threats on multiple fronts, and I think that they are looking at that. If you talk to Shoigu again, he would be looking at this as this kind of almost like an anaconda strategy, that they're being completely surrounded on all fronts. So the idea would be, we'll deal with Ukraine one way, we'll deal with Caucasus in another way, we'll do with Central Asia in another way. But they cannot necessarily prioritize these because each of them has the potential to really seriously undermine the Russian national security and the security of Europe. I mean, any war in Ukraine, any kind of confrontation in Ukraine, and frankly, the national security of the United States. I don't think a war in Ukraine would serve the national security of the United States.
This is what you get when you hire a comedian as your president. But speaking of that, I just said that so that I can segue into the final topic, which is we have our own Minister of Comedy, Vahan Kerobyan. In economic news, Armenia's economic growth was finalized at 4.2% for the past year, for 2021, much lower than the government promises. In 2021, Vahan Kerobyan had promised double-digit growth and promised to resign if he didn't achieve that goal. So when he was confronted by journalists about these past promises, he said, and he was asked whether he's going to resign or not, he said, "I was kidding." And, in the past year, we've had a couple of economists on our podcast. Vartan Aramyan was on this podcast and predicted that the real growth would be around 5%, and Hrant Mikhaelian was predicting about 4.5%. So it's not impossible to predict Armenia's growth realistically. Meanwhile, last week, Nikol Pashinyan exclaimed in parliament that he was the one who forbid Kerobyan from resigning. I'm not sure what that means, forbidding. I guess are these people elected, selected, or slaves? I'm not sure. Hovig, Do you have something to say about this comedy of errors?
Well, I think that maybe they should rename the ministry to the Ministry of Comedy, or I don't know. So what was interesting about that exchange between Kerobyan is, first he said, that quote about him resigning was taken out of context, even though he made it multiple times, and he reaffirmed his decision. Then he said that what he was talking about was not the real GDP, but the nominal GDP growth, that it would be in double digits. But now, I mean, it's just like there's absolutely zero accountability.
I mean, at what point do you trust the promises that they're making?
The fact that they can get away unscathed, maybe that's how we lost the war, and they're still in there. But it's painful to see. I remember actually having this Twitter argument with someone who mentioned that Vahan Kerobyan is the only smart one out of the bunch. Why are you attacking him on Twitter?
Oh, that's ridiculous. Please. Well, the other thing is, I want to just talk in general about this. I mean, this is my rant, I guess you could say. That I'm doing a general rant, if I have that opportunity, against the Armenian government in general, because if we look at Alan Simonian, we look at all these clowns. Really, it's a clown show. I mean, I actually have contacts in Russia, and really the Russian response to all this is they're confused. They don't know who to talk to. They think that this government is very weak and indecisive.
You mean who to talk to in Armenia, right?
Who to talk to in Armenia.
Yeah.
I mean, they're looking for a partner in Armenia. They're not finding it in Armenia because they're finding this kind of crazy, government. So I, in general, would like to condemn, Nicole Pashinyan's government, particularly Alan Simonian. God forbid he becomes the president. He met recently with Nancy Pelosi, I believe. That was the results of this, as well too. And I'm not sure how that's going to enhance Armenia's national security in any way. I'm not sure how it's going to enhance security in Sunik or in Artsakh or anything like that.
Well, I know the U.S. has very large resources in Hollywood and comedy in general, so maybe we can import some comedy.
Well, I mean, but even the Armenian comedians, if we look at armed comedy, I mean, even if we look at, Narek and Sergei, they're against Nicole Pashinyan. So even the comedians are against the clowns in the government. So I don't know, Hovik. I think that personally, Alan Simonian, as I've said earlier on this podcast, once and for all, should resign. He should have resigned long ago. But I think that he should definitely resign now and call it quits. Well. All
right, we'll call this your rant.
Something tells me that we have a lot of Alan Simonian to see yet.
Unfortunately. Oh no, please don't. No more.
Speaking of rants, I was watching armed comedy, and I would like to strongly recommend our listeners to watch that, because it's the only form of, it's the only way sometimes you can catch the news without the doom and gloom. And they mentioned that recently, here's something funny. The Armenian government ran a competition, the education ministry ran a competition for 10 literary works that will be translated to foreign languages. Okay, hear this out. And suddenly, the work of a certain former journalist was selected. Nicole Pashinyan's book was selected to be translated into Albanian. And the Armenian government will supply, I think,
fund it. That's
$10,000, something around $10,000. I forget.
How does that, Hovik, let me stop you there. How does that even do anything good for Armenia? How will Albania, of all places, help Armenia's national security? Will Albania send troops to Artsakh? Will Albania send troops to Sunik?
Maybe Albania needs some comedy too. I don't know. And in other news, we still don't have a fully formed committee for defense and security in parliament. Artur Ghazinian was, rejected for the 17th time as the opposition nominee.
Hovik, maybe the opposition can now nominate him as a president. If we want real comedy.
It's very clear that the government is not playing. We talked about fullness. The government is not playing with a full deck. That's abundantly clear.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I was hoping that at least one of the promises, the election promises that they made, which was to launch an investigation into the 44-day war, would start to happen. There's no other way to say this, but civil contract is not interested in launching that investigation.
Why do you think?
I don't know why, but it's clear that they don't, because if they did, then they would accept.
Yes, they are really something. That's all I have to say. I don't know, Hovik.
All right, and on this happy note, let's throw in the towel and go home.
Let me also, so I don't really have a rant, but I do want to say something about one topic which we're not going to have time to approach, and that has to do with the stalled border demarcation process. Last week, among all this drama now, it got lost. Last week we noted that the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov had said that he had passed a bunch of new Armenian proposals about border demarcation to Azerbaijan. And then Armenian Foreign Minister Mirzoyan and the National Security Chair Armen Grigoryan clarified that proposal, right? They said that Armenia had proposed both sides should simultaneously pull back from their armed forces and deploy border troops along what is generally regarded as a Soviet border between republics. And then Azerbaijan rejected the proposal and called it preconditions that are unacceptable for them, and they demanded an immediate and unconditional start to the process of demarcating the border. All I want to say about this at the moment is that I was seriously concerned that if Azerbaijan is indicating that they are unhappy with these proposals and everything, Armenia should have itself under very high alert, because every time they have border provocations, we lose 2 or 3 Armenian soldiers, and I have a very hard time living that down.
Yeah, and also not only that, I mean, there's also frequent claims by Aliyev to all of Sunik. There you see from Azerbaijani social media accounts claims to the entire Republic of Armenia as Western Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like crazy.
Every time we have that kind of belligerent talk, we lose people, and it's just awful.
And on Monday, Nikol Pashinyan had another one of his 2-hour conferences, and he basically ignored all of these warnings and said, basically, don't pay attention to that. We want peace, and we're going to push the agenda of peace, which is really troubling. I mean, to be honest, I don't want.
This is a new era of peace. I'm joking.
It's just like, I don't want to contribute to the atmosphere of fear, but I don't know what else to do. We didn't talk about Nikol Pashinyan's 2-hour conference. I don't think it was worth our time, but it was basically some of the same old. The only interesting thing, I guess, that I'll mention from that conference as well, since we're talking about things that we didn't have a chance to fully cover, is that when he talked about Sarkissian's resignation, he said, well, I don't think that it's possible for him to be a foreign citizen because, we would have caught it. I mean, it's very disingenuous, because he himself, the former opposition leader in parliament, is on record questioning the status of the, Armen Sarkissian's citizenship.
All right. We're going to leave it there today. Thank you, Pietro.
Thank you very much.
Great conversation here.
Thank you, Hovik. Excellent conversation.
All right.
Thank you so much. And let us hope for the best for
peace.
Hayastan.
Yeah.
Peace.
And that concludes our program for this episode of Groong Week in Review. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from this previous week. We look forward to your feedback and suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at groong.org, that's Groong, and on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. I'm Hovik Manacharyan, and on behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening, and talk to you next week.